From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
The Supreme Court appears poised to allow abortions in medical emergencies in Idaho, according to an inadvertent posting briefly on its website, seen by Bloomberg. We'll have reaction this hour from Democratic Congressman Greg Landsman of Ohio.
Former Democratic Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy will also join us, the Democrat weighing in on the cases the court has yet to decide in this term, including the prosecution of January 6 defendants, along with Donald Trump's immunity.
This as Trump and Biden enter the final stretch of preparation before tomorrow's presidential debate. Our political panel helps set the stage. So, of course, we have a lot to look forward to tomorrow, Joe.
Yes, sir.
But we had a lot to dissect today.
Well, that's right. We didn't think we'd be talking about another Supreme Court ruling after we got two official rulings around 10 o'clock in the morning. We have a good sense of what another one may be, and we do start right there. Our top story, a Supreme Court decision accidentally or inadvertently, in the words of the court published online, before its planned release. Bloomberg Law obtaining a copy of the opinion in Moyle versus United States, showing that the court appears poised to side with the Biden administration here and allow emergency abortions in the state of Idaho. For more, we bring in Bloomberg's Supreme Court reporter, Greg Stohr. Greg, you've had quite a day here, and we'd like to start with the ruling that wasn't supposed to be revealed today. In this case, the Idaho abortion case. How does this happen? Is this something that got fat-fingered? Was it intentional? Will we ever know?
Yeah, we may not ever know. It seems like somebody posted it when they weren't supposed to. So it appeared around the time of those other two rulings. Mm-hmm. And what normally happens is that they release them as they're announced from the bench. Well, Chief Justice Roberts announced only two opinions from the bench, or he deferred to other justices to announce those opinions. Mm-hmm. Didn't say anything about this opinion. And it's possible that what happened was they were originally planning on issuing this opinion today, and one justice said, hey, I need to think about something a little bit more. I want to tweak something. And so the justices didn't do that, but the person in the court's publications unit went ahead and put it online. That's at least a possibility.
Okay, so however this ultimately went down, this, of course, happened. Bloomberg and Bloomberg Law got their eyes on this. Now we all know ahead of the presidential debate how the court is likely to rule. What we don't know is how they're likely to rule on some of these other cases, including the question of someone who's debating tomorrow night, Donald Trump, and whether he has presidential immunity. Why sit on any of these cases when they could be so politically consequential, or is it because exactly that reason?
Well, it is probably in part because of exactly that reason. They're big cases, and so they're spending a lot of time on them. Now, this is a very backloaded Supreme Court term. We still have about 10 opinions that still have to come out, and that is an awful lot for this late in June. That said, what we're seeing on this court is, even though they've got a solid conservative majority, they're all over the place. And so you look at that gun ruling last week where they had 7 separate opinions in that ruling, even though it was nominally 8-1. And so part of what might be going on, we'll see, may be that there are 9 individuals on this court who have, 9 or at least more than 1 or 2 separate views on what should happen in the Trump case.
We're on a 3-day tour here with the court today, tomorrow. Friday are opinion days. Will everything be out by the end of this week, or is the conventional wisdom right that this likely bleeds into July?
It's likely to bleed into July, and the reason is the court has a tradition. On the penultimate opinion day, the Chief Justice says, our final opinion day will be X. He hasn't done that yet. He may well do that on Friday. He may tell us that the last opinion day is, say, Monday or Tuesday of the following week.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we head into July. Bloomberg's Greg Stohr, thank you so much. It's been quite a day for you. Now let's get more on the political implications, potentially, of the court's expected decision and the decisions to come, and bring in Bloomberg's Gregory Korte. So, Gregory, as we've mentioned, this comes on the eve of the CNN presidential debate between Trump and Biden. Does this expected ruling, or what they appear poised to do, take away a talking point from Biden? The court doesn't seem ready to act to even further restrict abortion access.
It may well, although, look, this is abortion is going to be a talking point in this election, regardless of how the court rules on this. And we've had this steady onslaught of headlines, really these reverberations from the Dobbs decision over the past couple of years, where we have state legislatures taking up abortion legislation in their states. We have the abortion pill ruling. We have now this ruling on emergency abortions. And so it's really in the air. It's an unavoidable issue. And it's certain to come up tomorrow, where especially former President Trump is going to be on the defensive on this issue, because he's the president who appointed the justices who because of his justices, that's what led to the Dobbs decision. And he's tried to sort of walk back and moderate his position on abortion since the Dobbs ruling, saying he only wanted to send it back to the states. And so you can certainly expect President Biden to try to put Trump on the defensive to say, which is it? Did you want the Dobbs ruling? Did you want to ban abortion nationally? Yeah. Or because you say one thing in front of a conservative audience and maybe something a little bit more in terms of a mass audience?
Does this heighten increased calls for a federal law in this case? You've had two now in the Supreme Court, in this case in Idaho, and then the mifepristone abortion pill. Will the former President Donald Trump have to answer more to that call for a federal law?
Yeah, well, the reason why this was a federal issue, and of course, Greg could probably speak to this a little bit better than I can, but it really did invoke the spending power of the government, to use the Medicaid reimbursement power of the government to say, look, if you're going to take this federal money for Idaho hospitals, you also have to play by the federal rules of how you administer this this particular medical procedure. And so, yeah, there are a lot of different ways that this can become a federal issue. Abortion in the military, among military service members who may be stationed in a state that prohibits abortion. That's a federal issue. So there's any number of ways where this can come up and become a presidential issue in the next administration.
Well, if it's a presidential issue, that means it likely is going to be debated tomorrow night. And we talked about the stakes in that debate with senior DNC spokesperson Hannah Muldaven earlier on Balance of Power about what Joe Biden needs to do.
It's been 4 years since Americans have seen Joe Biden and Donald Trump on a debate stage. Yeah. A lot has happened in those 4 years. We just mentioned women's rights being taken away. Donald Trump has been impeached twice and is now a convicted felon on 34 counts. What Joe Biden needs to do is speak directly to the American people about what he's done.
Gregory, is tomorrow night as much about speaking about what he's done or speaking it well, speaking it in a coherent manner, not having any gaffes or any pause moments as he's debating at 81?
You know, it's remarkable. We usually talk about, you'll hear politicians say that elections are about the future. And ordinarily, a debate like this, you would have two candidates talking about what they want to do in their next term as president. This is the first time we've had a televised debate between two people who have already been president. And so, by definition, they're going to be talking about their records, and they're going to be talking about the other person's record as well. A big part of the case for both of these men is to say that the other guy is disqualified, either because Biden is too old, or the Biden argument is that Trump is disqualified because he's a convicted felon, right? And so, yeah, I think we're going to have an unusual debate. This is also the earliest debate that we've ever had in history. The combined ages of the candidates is higher than we've ever had on a debate stage before. And so this is going to be one remarkable debate. And add to that the fact that this is a CNN-controlled debate. First debate in decades that the Commission on Presidential Debates hasn't hosted. So it's CNN's rules here.
Yes,
and we'll have to see how that changes the dynamic as we look at these guys side by side.
We'll bring you special coverage of the debate tomorrow, 8 p.m. Eastern Time here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Gregory Korte, we thank you for helping us set the table as we turn now to the results of the most expensive congressional primary in American history. It brings us to New York, where Democratic incumbent Jamal Bowman lost his seat to challenger George Latimer in a race that symbolized, at least to some, larger divisions within the party nationally, but also the role that Israel is playing as an issue in this campaign. Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Julie Fine. And I wonder your thoughts on this, Julie, how much this had to do, for instance, with $15 million in spending from AIPAC versus Jamal Bowman's own weakness as a candidate.
Well, I think there's a little bit of both there. But listen, $15 million in spending, I mean, that just gives you an enormous amount of airtime and a way to get your message out. Jamal Bowman had had a very difficult few months as it is, and he was losing popularity with his constituency. I think this is something that candidates running for office need to be well aware of on the campaign trail. What a big role the Israel-Hamas role will play in this.
So as we consider this candidate in particular, obviously a member of the squad, quite progressive, losing to someone who is more of a moderate, more of a centrist, Julie, and considering the other primaries we had last night in states like Utah and Colorado, are we seeing a move toward the center in those who were victors?
Well, let's talk about the Spencer Cox race. I mean, he won. He did not even have the backing of his state Republican party. So, again, this will not be the case in every race. This will depend on what state it's in and where the spending is. But this is something that candidates must pay attention to right now as they're trying to figure out how to run their platform, who they're speaking to, and where they live.
Hey, Julie, Congresswoman Lauren Boebert lives to see another day, extending her political life by moving to a completely different congressional district in Colorado. When she rallied last night, her victory rally, she was wearing what looked like a pair of Donald Trump sneakers, the bright gold ones. Turns out they're fake from China. Is that MAGA?
Well, I think that these are also sold out as it is. What it ended up doing is this is a person that, this is a woman who moved districts in order to make sure that she won her race. The next day, they're not talking about her platform. They're not talking about her decisions. They're not talking about her win. They're talking about her sneakers. So there you go, on a day where you might want to talk about your victory, what you want to do and what you've accomplished. They're talking about your kicks. Exactly.
Of course, if you're watching us on Bloomberg TV, you can see the images for yourself if you're listening to us on radio. Maybe Google it. Bloomberg's Julie Fine, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, still ahead, we'll have a conversation with Democratic Congressman Greg Landsman of Ohio following his recent trip to Israel. And, of course, his reaction to the news we got today surrounding the Supreme Court. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The state of abortion rights in our country is because of Donald Trump. When he was elected, he bragged about electing 3 conservative justices and overturning Roe v. Wade. And because of that, we see a dire state in our country for women of reproductive age. 21 states and counting where women don't have access to reproductive freedom that they've enjoyed for 50 years.
That was Hannah Muldaven, senior spokesperson for the DNC, earlier today on Bloomberg, discussing the Supreme Court copy opinion that was briefly posted on their website and seen by Bloomberg Law that would allow emergency abortions in Idaho. Of course, this is not a final ruling yet. Joining us now for more is Congressman Greg Landsman, the Democrat from Ohio, live from Capitol Hill this evening. Thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio, Congressman. You, of course, represent the state of Ohio, a state which last year voted in a very high turnout vote, mind you, to enshrine abortion rights into the state constitution. But that is when abortion was literally on the ballot and the Roe overturning the Dobbs decision was much fresher. If the Supreme Court is not acting in this case or in the mifepristone case to restrict access to abortion even further, is it going to have the same galvanizing effect in this election cycle? Can Democrats count on it?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a huge issue. It's an issue of health care and basic fundamental freedom, a freedom that was taken away from millions and millions of women and girls all across the country. And so you're seeing the impact, and it's bad. The stories keep piling up, and they're awful stories about women who were turned away, or women who had to go to another state to get health care, or women who've died. I think it becomes even more relevant the further we get from Dobbs. The only way to fix this is to restore this fundamental freedom, which Congress has to do.
Is it possible for Joe Biden to make that case before the nation tomorrow night if he continues to be reluctant to use the word abortion? Does the language need to be more up to date, Congressman, to make an impact?
Yeah, I think you can talk about reproductive freedom, you can say abortion, and I'm not sure what word he'll use, but it is healthcare. It's basic, fundamental, core healthcare, and that's a freedom that women and girls had. It was taken from them, and now politicians are trying to decide what kind of healthcare you can and can't get, and everyone, or I should say, most people, the vast majority of Americans, don't want that.
Of course, this news that Bloomberg broke comes just on the eve of tomorrow's presidential debate, Congressman. I'm sure President Biden will be focusing on the abortion issue quite heavily in light of it. But what is the message he most needs to drive home tomorrow night? What do you and your constituents in Ohio need to hear from him?
Yeah, I think this election is about, the chaos and extremism that we've seen, that most of us are tired of. It's been exhausting. Trump is a chaos agent, now a convicted felon. But what I hear most back home in Southwest Ohio is that we want everyone to quiet down and do their jobs, do it in a bipartisan way, get things done. Help us out, but certainly don't do things to hurt us. And whether it was January 6th and trying to upend the presidential election, or it was overturning Roe and taking away reproductive freedom from millions and millions of women and girls, to a whole, to book bans, you name it. And quite frankly, the economy and the fact that Trump wants to spend another $3 trillion giving billionaires more money at the expense of the rest of us. That's chaos, and people want normal, pragmatic, bipartisan leadership, and I think that's got to be the core message.
We just got new numbers on the campaign from the New York Times, Siena College. Congressman, it finds that most people don't care that Donald Trump was found guilty on 34 felony charges, and that only 72% of voters who cast a ballot for Joe Biden 4 years ago say they approve of the job he's doing as president. What do you hear from your constituents in Ohio that's making them feel this way when they look back to where they were 4 years ago? Is it just inflation?
Yeah, it's a huge deal. I mean, the people are just tight, struggling to pay all their bills, and there's a frustration, and I think you see that in the polling when they go to vote, because when you start to talk about the things that matter most, I do hear, look, we have got to protect this democracy. We've got to be serious about restoring the freedoms that have been taken away and be done with these culture wars issues. We've got to fix the parts of the economy that are broken, where you have these mega corporations and billionaires making just this insane amount of money at our expense. I mean, the American people are pretty smart. We know who's taking our money. Like when we go to the grocery store and we buy stuff, we know who's charging us, higher prices, and we can see it on Instagram and TikTok and television, what the billionaire folks in this country, how they're living. And I think most Americans want that fixed. And I do believe that Joe Biden, who grew up in Scranton, has a much better sense of how to do that, whereas Trump wants to spend trillions and trillions of dollars, giving tax giveaways to millionaires, billionaires, and big corporations at the expense of the rest of us.
Something that the president has been struggling with since the events of October 7th, really, and what has gone down in Gaza in the days since then, Congressman, is his stance toward Israel. This is a division in the Democratic Party we saw on display just last night when one of your colleagues, an incumbent in Jamal Bowman, lost a primary in part over the Israel issue. I know you were just there in the country yourself, Congressman. How should Democrats be messaging the Israel question, not just tomorrow for Biden, but in this cycle?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, look, having been there many times as a new member, and I had worked over there, had spent a lot of time in the region, you're talking about two historically traumatized people, Israelis, Jews, Palestinians. What happened on October 7th, 3,000 terrorists invaded a country. They didn't just kill people, they slaughtered them. They tortured people. They raped women. They raped them and then killed them. I mean, and they've taken hostages. 120 hostages still remain, including 8 Americans. And so where we all can, I believe, be aligned is that terrorist organization needs to be dismantled. The IDF, Israel, is weeks away from dismantling the military capabilities of Hamas. That will allow for any number of really positive things, including putting the Middle East on a path to peace. The situation in the north requires us to stand very tall and very strong alongside Israel and our other global partners to ensure that Hezbollah and Iran stand down and move back. In the end, all the hostages go home, Gaza gets rebuilt, and we are on the path to a sustainable peace.
Mm-hmm. Stay in touch with us on this, Congressman. We know that this is not going away anytime soon. Greg Landsman, Democrat from Ohio, on Balance of Power, one of the last left in the building this evening. Coming up, the trial of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, beginning today in Russia. We'll have more on that next. Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's not a trial as I understand it. We view it more as a secret hearing at which a judge will endorse the accusations, false accusations against Evan, after which he will be convicted. So the due process just isn't part of the process.
That's Wall Street Journal assistant editor Paul Beckett with us a bit earlier today here in Washington as the trial begins in Russia for American journalist Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter on trial for espionage after Russia accused him of spying for the CIA. Now, this is the first time since the Cold War that a U.S. reporter, an American reporter, has been tried for this crime by Russia. The trial is taking place behind closed doors. Wall Street Journal editor-in-chief Emma Tucker writing in a letter to readers today, quote, "This bogus accusation of espionage will inevitably lead to a bogus conviction for an innocent man who would then face up to 20 years in prison for simply doing his job." The Wall Street Journal and the State Department both maintain Gershkovich's innocence. And Kayleigh, it's remarkable to think he has been in prison since March of last year.
Yeah, and could remain so for some time after this initial hearing in this trial today. The next one isn't until mid-August. Yeah. So it could potentially be days more. Of course, we heard from Paul Beckett today that the administration is still actively in talks with Russia in regard to Evan's case, and they remain hopeful he will be freed. But, of course, it is a very difficult thing indeed. Now, still ahead, we'll be joined by former Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy live on what to expect in the Supreme Court's January 6th case. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We're going into yet another presidential election, and we have not seen the cases from 2020 disposed yet. I'm worried about the impact it's going to have, because one of the things about enforcing the law is ensuring deterrence against people continuing to, engage in that kind of illegal activity, which, again, is so detrimental to our democracy as a whole.
It's the Attorney General of Michigan, Dana Nessel, speaking with us earlier today here on Bloomberg TV and radio about court cases surrounding the January 6th Capitol attack, and more specifically, a ruling that we're anticipating from the Supreme Court, specifically on an obstruction charge that is being levied against some of the greatest offenders from the insurrection. Joining us now is Stephanie Murphy, former Democratic Congresswoman from Florida, former member of the January 6th committee. Congresswoman, it's great to see you as always. Good to have you back in Washington. I wonder, how concerned you are potentially about the Supreme Court watering down the case against these January 6th offenders.
My hope is that they don't, because it's not just about the January 6 offenders. It's about the rule of law and the ability for Congress to subpoena and secure information and be able to enforce, and also for the judicial system to be able to call witnesses and things like that. You want to do it for the system, not necessarily for this particular case, because the shoe may be on the foot in the future, and a different party may be the one that's in the wrong. So my hope is that they look at it for in a holistic way.
Well, and thinking about all of the ways in which this ruling ultimately could translate, it potentially impacts the case brought against former President Trump here in Washington, which related to the events in and around January 6th of 2021. This could potentially remove some of the charges against him. That is, of course, if the court doesn't rule him immune from prosecution entirely in that case. We're awaiting both of these decisions on the eve of a presidential debate in which Donald Trump is participating. Is there any way in your mind, Congresswoman, to separate the court from politics right now, or is this all inherently political?
My hope is that the court can be apolitical. I mean, the American people are desperate for some institution that isn't just completely eaten up by partisanship. And so it's really important that they do look at this without a partisan lens, and my hope is that they'll do that. But I think when you're talking about the debate, I don't think the American people are going to be listening in the debate for what is said about January 6th. They're listening for what is going to be said about the economy and the future of this country, and who's going to lay out a plan to make lives better here in America.
This, of course, will come down to an interpretation of obstructing an official proceeding, which is a law that was written up about Enron in 2002. So this could come down to a technicality. And I don't want to talk to you the whole time that you're here about January 6th. But in a couple of weeks, once we get through this debate tomorrow, we're going to be at a convention in Milwaukee. I think you're going to be there.
I will be.
There's talk about Donald Trump bringing members of the so-called January 6th choir up on stage, that some of these very people we're talking about will be featured at the convention. What should we make of this?
I think that's part of his shtick, right? This is a part of what
he's promised to pardon them.
Yeah, he's promised to pardon them. He's promised to try to indict January 6th select members. But at the end of the day, our judicial system is built in part upon fellow Americans, people who get called to sit on grand juries and be a part of the judicial system. The folks who got convicted for their role in January 6th were convicted by a jury of their peers. And I know that there's a lot of talk in the Republican Party and to try to kind of confuse things and muddy the waters on that. But they got fair trials in front of their peers.
Of course, we are likely to see at least some of this coming up in the debate, even if, as you were arguing, this isn't necessarily what the American people most want to hear from either of these candidates. But on the subject of the debate, we spoke earlier today with Cliff Young, or at least Joe did, the president of U.S. Public Affairs at Ipsos, about expectations for each candidate tomorrow night.
Biden has to go in and show that he's competent, that he's presidential, that he doesn't have a cognitive agility problem. And ultimately, as I was saying, he has to show more. He has, in some ways, more to lose, more downside than Trump. The American populace expects Trump to be irreverent, to be kind of all over the place. That is his style.
Can policy even really break through in a debate that appears to be at least so much about expectations of pure performance of these older candidates?
You know, I think what will happen is that there aren't going to be wide swaths of Americans watching all 90 minutes of the debate. What will likely happen is there will be clips that come out, moments that come out of the debate that will be seen most likely on social media platforms. And people are in their own ideological cul-de-sacs on these social media platforms. So they're likely to see clips of things that reinforce what they already believe about the candidates. I'm not sure that this is anything that's going to swing those undecided voters who, quite frankly, haven't really picked their heads up to pay much attention to the election. They tend to be a little later in the cycle before they really engage.
Well, it's an awfully good point. People are celebrating the rules here. I know the mics are going to be cut off. But what we've done is create an environment, as you describe, that encourages the viral moment that encourages both of these men to show up with zingers and one-liners, which kind of defeats the purpose, doesn't it? Why even have a debate if we're at this point?
Well, they have to debate, but debates used to mean something when they were introducing candidates to the American people. There's nobody in America who doesn't know who Donald Trump and Joe Biden are, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, this debate may not have the same impact that previous debates have had when it's new candidates.
Okay, so if potentially you're not going to be telling them anything new about yourself, you try maybe to just make your policy stances more well-known or at least more well-defined. How much of the debate tomorrow night do you think will actually be these candidates forced to cite specific policy ideas versus kind of things that Donald Trump has been floating, say, in regard to the tax code and tariffs? And will there be any consequence if they don't do that, if they still are talking in kind of grand ideas? I think it's important. It's an opportunity for Biden to exceed expectations about his performance, kind of the way he did at the State of the Union. And then the other thing is to really pin Trump down on some of these tax plans that he has that really are meant to benefit the wealthy and not really do much for average Americans. Pin him down on, what he plans on doing to actually lower costs for the American people. The hope is that they both put out a vision for what America looks like so the American people have a choice.
What's more important for the outcome of this cycle? I think I know your answer. Will it be the debate tomorrow night or Donald Trump's sentencing on the 11th of July?
I believe that Donald Trump's sentencing is sort of baked into what people believe about him. His base doesn't seem to mind. I think there's shirts that say, "I'm with the felon," so they're almost celebrating it. So his base isn't going to leave him given the outcome of the sentencing. For independent voter, and the Democrats know that this is part of what they don't like about Trump is his willingness to be above the law. And for independent voters, they're mostly focused on the economy.
All right, former Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy of Florida, thank you so much for joining us here in studio. It's always great to see you, of course, as we consider Trump's conviction and the difference it makes. The new polling that just dropped from the New York Times and Siena College finds more than 2/3 of voters said the outcome of that case made no difference to their vote. 90% of Republicans still view Donald Trump favorably. Now, still ahead, George Latimer's victory over New York Congressman Jamal Bowman in last night's Democratic primary marks the first election loss for a squad member and incumbent. We'll be joined by our political panel with the details next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We argue, we debate, find a way to come together. This country cannot afford to split into little pieces, and every single representative has to understand the necessity for unity so that we can move forward as a nation.
That was George Latimer, Westchester County executive, speaking to supporters after defeating incumbent Jamal Bowman in the New York 16th Congressional District Democratic primary last night. Of course, in Bowman's case, this is the first instance in which a Democratic incumbent has gone down in this primary cycle. Joining us now for more, our political panel, Maura Gillespie, founder and principal at Bluestack Strategies, and Matt Bennett, Third Way co-founder. Welcome to both of you. Matt, as the Democrat, I will come to you first. Bowman, of course, is a member of the squad. He is a progressive who just lost, and by a wide margin, mind you, about 17 points to someone more moderate. Is this a warning to progressives everywhere, or is this a unique case?
I think it might be a little of both. There's no question that most members of the squad are safe from primary, but there are others, like Cori Bush, who's going to face a tough one coming up next month. And I think it's important to emphasize the Democratic primary voters keep telling the far left over and over and over, we do not want a showboat. We do not want somebody who is going to be about, purity tests. And we want somebody that's going to go and get things done. That is what Latimer offered. It is definitely not what Bowman offered. And they keep not listening to that message. So I think you will see a tough race. Cori Bush's race is going to be very close, but I think you're going to keep seeing these kinds of things.
The common denominator there would be AIPAC, which spent $15 million to help defeat Bowman and is now targeting Cori Bush. Maura, what did Republicans learn last evening about their approach here, particularly when it comes to progressive Democrats?
I think what we learned overall last night, both parties, was that with the exception of Lauren Boebert, those fringe candidates who are either on the far left or the far right really don't, meet where the American people are. They're not representing the American people and the interests that they care about. Again, Matt's pointing about showboats. These are people who are simply in this for themselves, for some semblance of idea of fame, of getting notoriety. And that's not, at the end of the day, that's not what families want in their members of Congress to be representing them. They want them to be focused on the issues that impact them. And so, you saw some more moderate members win in races that weren't necessarily endorsed by Donald Trump, for the Republicans, I'll say, like John Curtis in Utah, that was a big win, and things of that nature. So I think I'm hopeful that means people are looking towards the middle and veering away from those far fringes.
Well, Maura, you mentioned Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, who, of course, switched districts and then in that new district won her primary last night. This is a little taste of what she had to say after the fact.
We've defeated the Uniparty a couple of times this year. The people have spoken. They do not want the Uniparty representing them. But what you do want is a unified Republican Party that puts America first, and that's the representation you are going to get.
So, Maura, obviously those remarks came where she was wearing a pair of sneakers that caught everyone's attention as well. But her remarks on the Uniparty, when you were just talking about how we are seeing wins for more moderates, doesn't necessarily sound like in Colorado's 4th District that's going to be the case.
Lauren Boebert is a contradiction amongst herself and what she purports to stand for versus how she behaves. So I really don't know that she is the arbiter of what the vibe is in America or what the mood is towards what we're looking for in our politics. So in that regards, I don't necessarily think that any of her rally speeches are going to be something that will apply across the board. And I'm grateful for that. So again, it's a shame for the people in her district who are now having her as a representative yet again, not yet again, she had to move because she couldn't be in her own district given the scandals that she was plagued with. So we'll see what turns out for her come November, but it wasn't as if she had a great crop of people to run against. It wasn't terribly challenging, and she's still barely eked by. So that should really tell you everything about the state of politics for Republicans like a Lauren Boebert.
You can admit, Matt, that you're happy Lauren Boebert's going to be around for a little longer as a Democrat.
It's not terrible for Democrats. I will say it's, to Maura's point, Lauren Boebert ran away from her district. She has a congressional district. She is a member of Congress, and she ran away because Adam Frisch came within a couple of hundred votes of beating her last time and was going to beat her this time. There's virtually no question of that. She knew she was going to lose because, to Maura's point, she's far too radical, even for the very conservative people in that district. She's now in a district that is even redder, and maybe she's able to pull that out. But these kind of clownish figures, some of them are going to lose, some of them are going to stay there and continue to really tarnish their own party. So I guess that's good for Democrats, but it's bad for America to have Boebert in Congress.
I don't know, Kayleigh, I'm surprised she couldn't get the real Trump shoes. I think she has a connection there, I felt like. The fakes from China, a little different. Coming up, we're only a day away, at last, from CNN's presidential debate between, of course, Donald Trump and Joe Biden. We'll talk with our panel about what has changed since the two candidates last met. That was 4 years ago. We'll have more on that next.
The question is, radical left. Will you shut up, man? Listen,
no, the answer to the question is no.
Like many, I look forward to hearing Donald Trump lay out his vision for the country. It's a positive vision. It's a forward vision. He is excited. I expect that you're going to see a sharp contrast between President Trump's positive agenda and Joe Biden's proven weakness. It doesn't matter if he drinks a whole gallon of energy drinks. He's not going to be able to match the acumen and the readiness of Donald Trump.
Energy drinks, how quaint. Thought there was going to be a drug test before this thing. That was the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, earlier today weighing in on tomorrow's big matchup between President Biden, Donald Trump, the former president. As we reassemble our panel for their take, Maura Gillespie is here, founder and principal at Bluestack Strategies, and Matt Bennett, the co-founder of Third Way. Maura, this is going to be interesting to watch, if not hard to watch. Lisa Camuso-Miller described this debate to us last evening as a car accident scheduled for Thursday night. What's the strategy for Joe Biden here? I have to ask you this, or Donald Trump. Maybe you can hit both of these, knowing that their mics will be shut off at the end of their allotted time. Do they play along with the rules they agreed to?
I hope they do. I think that for the American people who are going to be tuning in, which I don't know how many will, I think people are just not interested in this race. But for some comedians, they are certainly going to pay attention because it's going to give them plenty of material to work with. But I think for voters who are actually interested in learning anything, I hope that the two candidates deliver. There's plenty they can say to squabble with one another and to target and attack one another. But what we would really like to hear is a plan. What do they have to address the economy? Whether or not the numbers show it, explain to us why, people at home still aren't able to afford a home or afford the groceries. And for Donald Trump, he has a lot of things to say, but some of them go off on tangents that no one can quite comprehend. So I hope he has some sort of semblance of a plan of what he would do if he was given, back into the White House. So again, I hope that they are able to keep themselves structured by policy, but I unfortunately don't see that being the case tomorrow.
Well, on the eve of tomorrow, today, in fact, the New York Times and Siena College just released their latest national poll, in which they find Trump with his biggest lead among likely voters, 48% to Biden's 44%. His lead is even larger when it's registered voters. He's leading by 6 percentage points. Can Biden shrink that gap with his performance tomorrow meaningfully?
I don't know if he can do it with his performance. I think he certainly can do it over the next 4 months. And I think a couple of things are important to keep in mind. One is Trump, all the polling shows that Trump has huge leads with people who don't vote. So there's a whole bunch, the people who voted in 2020, the race is basically tied. The people who voted in the primaries and in the general election in 2022, Biden is leading. Where Trump leads enormously is with people who did not vote in 2020. And so that's a danger sign for Trump in these polls. The race is tied. It's basically just within or just outside the margin of error. And so any big thing can move the needle one way or the other. What I don't expect to see tomorrow night is anything resembling what the speaker was talking about in that clip. That has never happened. Donald Trump has never offered a positive vision filled with policy ideas for the American people. It is always grievance. It is always anger, and we're going to see that.
Should Joe Biden address Donald Trump directly tomorrow night?
Sure. I'm sure he will do that. I do think, to your earlier question, that Biden will remain within the rules because Biden's fundamental premise is that he is about order and Trump is about chaos. And the kind of chaos we saw in the first debate last time when Trump was talking over, that is squarely within the Biden message.
Well, speaking of message, we know that Biden is likely to hit Trump on the abortion issue in particular. We did get some news in that regard. Bloomberg breaking it today, Maura, after inadvertently the Supreme Court posted a copy opinion of the emergency abortion in Idaho case. It, of course, was quickly taken down. It isn't a final opinion, and yet it does seem that the court is poised to rule in favor of emergency abortion access. Is that a gift to Donald Trump tomorrow night? It's not a fresh opportunity for Joe Biden to attack him on that issue?
It will point to Donald Trump, who has largely evaded this question and tried to not fully answer it. And I do think that tomorrow night he'll be asked point blank about where does he stand on abortion. And again, he has said, OK, give it to the states. But then we've seen the repercussions of that with Arizona and the like. So it'll be interesting. He will have to answer that question directly, whether he does so or not, but he'll be asked it. And I look forward to hearing what he has to say, because I do think that there is a large swath of Republican voters who feel very strongly about this, but maybe aren't outspoken. And it doesn't align with the far right strict abortion stances that Trump supporters are taking.
Really interesting line from Cliff Young at Ipsos, who we heard from a little bit earlier. He says the candidate who performs better at the main issue wins the election roughly 85% of the time. That's going to be inflation tomorrow night. Does Joe Biden talk about his own efforts, what he can do in the future, or point to Donald Trump and say tariffs will make it worse?
I think both, and it's not just tariffs. Everything in the Trump economic plan is inflationary. Certainly the tariffs, those are taxes that are going to make everything more expensive, but also the immigration plan. Deporting 9 million people from a full employment economy is going to drive inflation through the roof. He wants control of the Fed. All of these things are inflationary. Biden's going to make that point.
All right, Matt Bennett and Maura Gillespie, our political panel this evening. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us. And speaking of the debate, be sure to tune in tomorrow night for our special coverage of the CNN presidential debate. That starts right here on Bloomberg TV and radio at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be going right through until 11 p.m. after the fact. Of course, this debate is scheduled to be 90 minutes.
Eat your Wheaties. We'll meet you back here tomorrow. Thank you for joining us on Balance of Power, and we'll be back for more starting noon time, Bloomberg TV and radio. We'll see you then.